Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Sanjeev Mota from B&K Securities. Welcome all of you to another session of this thought leadership series. We really have a thought leader with us. He's been a pioneer in a very interesting sector, and I think his knowledge of various, topics, I think is just amazing. You can just watch one of his YouTube video, and I think you'll come out learning a lot. And that's what at least I feel I have done. Manish, he's the vice chairman of an executive vice chairman of Teamlease. Manish, thank you so much for taking your valuable time and doing this with us.
Thanks, Sanjeev. Great to be here.
Yeah. So Manish, as we spoke, the way we'll do it is I'll ask some questions. We also have Yogesh, our analyst, and he may have some questions as well. And if any participant has any question, you can put it in the Q&A box and we'll moderate that. So that's the way it is. So Manish, again, thanks for joining. What I'll start with is something that you've written in your in the annual report also recently, and I think in one of the videos I was watching, you've talked about that how COVID could be kind of a transformative moment where you've talked. I think you've quoted John Kingdon saying that this is an opportunity in a way where the policy has to come together. Maybe you can talk a bit more about it. I think it's very interesting to hear your detailed thoughts on this.
See, COVID is not climate change. It's a passing shower. So I think too much of excitement is being paid to what needs to be done immediately. But what COVID has been is an X-ray for India. It has not created new conditions. It's exposed pre-existing conditions. And sometimes we can come to the solutions, but sometimes the solutions proposed during COVID were very interesting to me. There's only three things policy can do. Policy can do fiscal solutions, you can do monetary solutions, and you can do structural solutions. If fiscal deficits could make countries rich, then no country would be poor, right? So if just spending money would make countries less. So a lot of people have, state governments now spend about 40 lakh crores, the central government spends 34 lakh crores, but we are at the limits of the fiscal deficit that a country like India can prudently afford. Monetary policy, I've spent some time on it in the last few years, and I'm not sure whether it's a placebo, it's a painkiller, or a steroid. Whatever it is very short term. And so, we can have it as a painkiller, I agree, but monetary policy is surely not a way to increase productivity. So I think what COVID has exposed that fiscal and monetary policy, while they occupy a lot of time and attention, it's actually only structural reform that can raise countries' productivity. Eliud Kipchoge is a Kenyan marathoner who got the gold medal. He's a famous guy, and he said something very nice after the last Olympics, that you run the first half of the marathon on your legs and the second half of the marathon on your mind. And I think that's really true for India. You're throwing more land, labor, and capital, which is not going to help. India doesn't have a shortage of land, labor, capital, by the way. If you give every Indian house half an acre, they could fit into Rajasthan and half of Maharashtra. We have 40% of our labor force is Vela anyway. It works in agriculture or self-employment. And I think our 150 unicorns prove that for the right opportunities, a lot of foreign capital is interested in India. And so I think what COVID does is it reinforces three windows. There's a structural window, there's a geopolitical window, and there's a productivity window, let's call it. The structural window is there's a new world of work, there's a new world of organizations, there's a new world of education. We have seen how online education has its limitations, but we've also seen how it can provide some continuity. I think work from home became work from anywhere. Work from anywhere and asynchronous tools means that the resistance to offshoring for technology, if you're working from Denver or Colorado and you, for your company in San Francisco, you can do it from Pune or Bangalore much more. So our 5 million offshore tech offshoring is going to go to 10 million. So I think that the structural changes in the world of work, education, and organization favor India. But there are geopolitical things which favor India, which are really what China is doing. I mean, it's like Xi Jinping has made a list of what Deng Xiaoping did right, and he is one by one removing all of them, which is great for a country like India. We must remember that India and China had the same per capita income in 1991. And so we can do the Jai car of 1991, but it was substantial, but it was incomplete. We had left out formalization, we had left out corruption, we had left out education, we had left out banking. So I think it's important to recognize that 1991 was substantial but incomplete, and China really, now their 5 times per capita income gap really came after 1991, not between 78 and 91 when people thought Deng was in charge. So the shift of sort of um, economic gravity to Asia is also coming at a time of capital glut all over the world. 40% of the world's bonds trade at less than 1% interest rates, 20% trade at less than, negative interest rates. And so in a world where fixed income becomes no income, I think India is the only country in the world with 20 years of growth ahead of it and 200 million people, or, a large country with 20 years of growth, of course, for our past sins, but we are one of the few. So this is a unique sort of positioning for India where economic gravity is shifting to Asia. China is doing all it can to become unpredictable. And we sort of have 20 years of growth, which we're now, I would say, ready to exploit because of the structural window. So I think COVID has focused fiscal minds, as you've seen the getting done of Air India, which has been trying for a long time, only happened when you agreed that it would not be a going concern if the government had kept it for another 2-3 years. So I think the willingness to take an 80-90% haircut on the debt, which is exactly what NCLT has been doing in a commercial situation, would have almost been unimaginable in a bilateral privatization negotiation 5 years ago. But it was clear that financial distress is like ice cream: the more you wait, the more it melts, and there would have been nothing to sell in 2 years. So I think that so COVID has focused policy minds on the reality that structural reform, which is formalization, urbanization, industrialization, financialization, and human capital, is really the only choice that India has left. We are at the limits of monetary policy. RBI has done a good job, but RBI has liquidity powers. It can lend money. It can't spend money, and I think that's important to remind ourselves. I think our tax to GDP ratio is our public debt to GDP ratio going into COVID was 72%. It's now 90, or maybe 94 by the time COVID is over. So I think the structural window that India sees when the problem, solution, and opportunity come together has not been seen for a long time. Some of it is forced. The governments, many state governments are at the absolute limits of what they can spend. So I think that the structural changes, whether it is labor reform, whether it is digitization, whether it is formalization, which if there's anything that we now cannot dispute the data about the last few years, it is formalization. And our 63 million enterprises only translating to 23,500 companies with a paid up capital of more than 10 crores is one of the reasons why domestic markets have been small. India is not a large market, it's a small market with a big potential. And one of the reasons was, there are many reasons. 42% of our labor force only produces 14% of GDP. 50% of our labor force is self-employed. See, these two were shock absorbers in India's labor market. If you were Vela, you were either a farmer or you were self-employed. So that's what made unemployment a very inappropriate or useless metric for measuring India's economic health. I know people, unemployment has stayed between 4 and 9% since 1947. That's quite a narrow band if you think about it, and I think that because India doesn't have a jobs problem, but it has a wages problem, is the framing that really captures the productivity of our regions, of our firms, and of our individuals and our sectors. IT is only 0.8% of India's labor force, but it's 8% of GDP. So I think the recognition of a policy window in India could be push, and it has also pull, right? I think that it is push because the fiscal and monetary options have run out of steam, but it is also pull. You know, GST formalization as a theme is being done voluntarily, and it is imposing short-term pain for long-term gain at an aggregate level. Now, I think it's interesting to think whether formalization, the big are getting bigger for some reason, right? I mean, brands are getting stronger, big are getting bigger. So I think that everything that we have done in policy in the last few years was a wonderful preparation for this next level, running the second half of the marathon on your mind. And I think COVID has just accelerated the super cycle of digitization, the super cycle of formalization that COVID has created. Is really not a once in a decade or once in a millennium. It's really once in the lifetime of a country kind of opportunity for people who are prepared for it. And I think we will look back 25 years from now as obviously 1991 being important, but at COVID really being an important turning point in productivity of firms and productivity of sectors and productivity of states. My parents live in UP and I live in Karnataka. Both states have the same GDP, but Karnataka has one-fourth the number of people. So you have to, it's 4 times more at a per capita productivity. And I think we have just done a calculation, India's GDP may be $2,000, but Bangalore's GDP is $14,000 per capita. And when you start thinking of that, I think that policy window or structural change is getting to critical mass and escape velocity, if not already there.
Right. That's great. But you just alluded to this point about, big getting bigger as a syndrome. And this is one of the pushbacks that I get, when I talked about how corporate India has done so well in this COVID and has been so resilient. And people ask me at whose cost. So what do you think? You actually serve, as a company, you have clients which are large and you have smaller clients as well. What is your experience? What is happening really on the ground?
I think demonetization accelerated digitization, of course, right? I mean, we can. There's no question we would not be at 3.5 billion payments a month with UPI if demonetization had not happened. I do think, to give credit where due, 2017, the geo was also very important in the acceleration of this digital economy that we are sort of seeing take off right now. So I think a combination of GST plus geo plus UPI created the conditions for, it's a discontinuity, even if you look at the valuations, DHRP, the valuations of the digital companies being fired. It's almost like 2008 to 17 was one calibration, and after 2017, because of internet penetration, digital payments, and the formalization. So I think absolutely, I think that some of it is just rebadging of existing demand. But there is no question that these three factors have enabled the creation of some new demand. Now, people say, what do you mean by creation of new demand? I think that, if half our labor force is Vela, and out of 63 million enterprises, we don't need 63 million enterprises. The US economy is 8 times our size and it only has 24 million enterprises. So most of these enterprises were forget about close to zero marginal productivity. They were close to zero absolute productivity. It actually made, they were very, they were not self-employment, they were self-exploitation. Right? There was this Russian economist called Chayanov who said that who convinced Nehru in the 1920s that small farms are viable because you don't pay yourself a salary, you don't pay your kids a salary, and you don't pay rent. A large part of corporate India was self-exploiting, and enterprise India, not corporate India. And I think corporate India has gained at the expense of enterprise India because during COVID, digitization super cycle, working capital challenges. I mean, shareholders don't pay salaries, customers do. and MSMEs did not have the working capital abilities. So I think that this big is getting bigger. It's still early to conclude conclusively, but I would suggest that the volume growth, the revenue growth of large corporate India is really not all new demand or pent up demand. It is really taking away from the informal sector, which anyway we have always had a challenge to measure. So it'll always be impossible to say of the 63 million enterprises, how many of them were actually really in competition with corporate India. I'm not sure we can ever conclude that. But I would say that it's the at least volume and revenue growth seems to suggest that there is some pent-up demand, there is some new demand, but a large part of it is just rebadge demand, which the bigger companies are taking at the expense of the smaller ones. Even within our own client base, we see that. Though I would, all whether small or big, all my client base is formal India. So it's
Right.
probably a sampling error from an economic perspective, and I wouldn't advise extrapolating our growth or our data to the whole economy. But at least for formal India, we are seeing that trespassers will be recruited, and if trespassers are being recruited, it is purely because 70% of our people are in sales, customer service, and logistics. And the second wave, while it was medically much harder than the first wave, was economically not bad at all.
Yeah.
Um, Either we had learned to handle lockdowns or people had learned to work from home. So, and in the first wave, when people had cut people, they really regretted it because the economy came back quickly and then they couldn't hire people again. So
Hmm.
I'd say in the second wave, people were also more steady, they were also more used, and they also are genuinely seeing demand surge in ways that they had not expected at this stage.
Right. So, there was this recent survey that came out. Manpower had done a global survey, and within that, they said in India is actually looking, probably the fastest growing from an employment perspective. Whereas we also spoke to Work India, which is more an HR of the blue collar uh, workers, and they were not seeing that kind of optimism as this. So again, is that a dichotomy that you're
Well, I mean, if you define blue collar as pure manufacturing employment, but
right?
China's farm to non-farm transition happened to factories. India's farm to non-farm transition is happening to sales, customer service, and logistics. So
Right.
I think you have to be careful with, I mean,
Mm.
India's manufacturing renaissance. I don't think India will ever go to 45% or 33 or 28% of our labor force in manufacturing, which were the peaks of China, US, and UK.
Right.
But I think 11% will go to 15%, 17, 18% of our labor force in manufacturing, which is, I think that we are seeing, so 11% going to 15, 18, given the PLI schemes, given everything else. But I don't think we will look like China when we grow up with 55% of our GDP being exports and, 35% of our labor force in agriculture. I think that India's prosperity, given we are coming of age not in 1978 or not in 2001 when WTO really supercharged China's exports. We are coming of age when global growth in the next few years is muted. I mean, it's not going to be the same that it was between 1978 and 2008. It will be better than the last few years, and that was so China really caught a sweet spot of global growth, global deconstruction of manufacturing supply chains, and global openness to trade. I mean, so I think that manufacturing, which is what a lot of people count on, will go from 11% to 15, 17, 18. That still is, 75 million new jobs. But I don't think manufacturing will become 25, 30, 40% of our labor force like it did in China at one point. So I think if you include sales, customer service, and blue collar, then you will see a very different level of optimism among corporate India just because hiring, domestic consumption, domestic demand is holding up quite well.
Right. Sure. Actually, one sector which is quite a conundrum to me, which is IT, and you actually made a comment recently that all companies have become digital now. It's not just and so the demand for IT resources has gone up, and I can see it in our organization also. It's not easy now to find people. What are you seeing, and how do we solve this problem out over a period of time? Because this is could be a huge engine of growth for India, right?
Yeah, I don't think we'll ever solve this problem, yeah. But this problem is not a dagger in the heart; it's a thorn in the flesh. IT companies will always crib about skills and always crib about salaries, but they need 500,000 people out of our 1.2 million engineers every year. So I think they'll be able to find it. They will have to spend some money on repair, prepare, and upgrade, which they have always done. I think the difference this time round is that the 1,800 global development centers, which really are a distinct category. In the past, we used to view software services companies as the source of demand, even if you included Accenture and IBM and added them, and Capgemini and added them to Infosys, Wipro, and TCS and others. But now there's a distinct demand of global development centers. Mercedes-Benz India is not a car company. 15,000 people write software, only 3,000 people make cars. Robert Bosch India has 22,000 people writing software and 4,000 people making spark plugs for Myco. I can give you tons of examples of where these global subsidiaries are no longer, they are more important to their parent for what they provide in terms of technology code writing than in terms of servicing the India market. I mean, JP Morgan, 25,000 financial services, Morgan Stanley. I could go on. So the 1,800 global development centers till now were only being offloaded. They were almost BPO outfits. I think what has happened in the last 2 years is they have really become core technology design outfits for them, because if you're working from home, you can work from anywhere. Asynchronous tools have been accelerated. So I think the combination of software services accelerating, the combination of 1,800 global development centers, but most importantly, Indian unicorns also hiring enough and having enough money to spend on technology. So I think that, but if there is any supply chain in India that is demand driven, it is IT. And we've already, we had gone up to 1.8 million, 18 lakh engineers a year in capacity. We came down to about 10 lakh. We've now gone up to about 12 lakh is my estimate, of which IT will only hire 4 lakh to 5 lakh. So I think you will find the people. I think IT also in this wave of IT growth, since we are now moving from BPO to design to UI to UX. I mean, every company is a digital company. 20% of the workforce is also non-engineers. So you're suddenly hiring graduates with other skills. And so I think, so the switching costs that China has in manufacturing, India has in technology. So I am quite clear that the US workforce in technology is 10 million. That will come down to 5 million, and we'll go from 5 million to 10 million. Not because we just can. I don't think the US can anymore produce engineers and doesn't have the ecosystem that India is starting to develop because of various reasons, because of unicorns, because of global development, more importantly, because of alumni of software services companies. I'd say the biggest, resource we now have, what we thought was brain drain, is becoming brain circulation. So, that hard partition between software services and software products is going away in a SaaS world, because in a SaaS world, you don't have that kind of product cycles that software used to have in the past. So I think for Indian IT, I think we can all safely bet that the 5 million employment is going to 10 million employment. I think actually it's going to be a disproportionate share of value also captured, because you're moving up the value chain. At one, we were used to be 80% time and material billing. We came down to 40% time and material billing. I think we're going to come down to 20, 30 time and material billing. And that means that the value capture will also be larger. So is there a crunch right now in terms of the ability to find people? Sure, but Bangalore or Hyderabad, last week for a client, we hired 1,000 Hadoop programmers in 1 week. I mean, there's nowhere else in the world you could do that, right? 1,000 people in 1 week. So I think there is a little bit of going to be an increase in salaries, obviously. I think that was overdue anyway. But the entry level salary has stayed constant for almost 10 years, and that will probably not move much. What will move up much is the gradient of middle level managers. But counter to this volume increase is also an organization redesign. See, first, organizations in IT were organized as pyramids, but because of high tide, they have become cylinders.
Mhm.
Now they are going to be Eiffel Towers. You
Right.
know, they have very huge bases, very huge desks, but their project management, the middle layer is almost disappearing. So I think that's also a cost balance that they will have. So I think IT is a very interesting, it's almost an unfair advantage that India has in IT, which in pharma is being challenged, right? Because of
Yeah.
what's going on in the US market and stuff like that. So there is obviously still a pharma story which has to be played out. But I think in IT, we are almost just at the end of the beginning. It's not anything else.
Right. So you are not so worried about the supply side. You are saying that there's enough engineers that are coming out, and in terms of reskilling possibility also, you think is there a reskilling possibility of people who are around? Because you know what you hear is
Absolutely. I mean,
most of the time you
we are
hear.
shifting, yeah. We're
No, I'm saying
shifting
most
the
of the time you hear
onus
that the
onto
quality
individuals.
is not good of people, the engineers coming out. That is the challenge that you hear.
Yeah, but that's true of every country in every time in history. That was true of Silicon Valley in the 70s. That was true of that's true of Germany today in manufacturing, which we consider the German apprenticeship system to be the world's answer to everything. So I would say that I think employers will always want people at less cost with higher skills. I don't think it's a binding constraint. I'm not saying it's easy, but I think that it's a thorn in the flesh, it's not a dagger in the heart. It's
Right.
painful, but it's not a binding constraint. I don't think that the lack of supply will hold us back from going from 5 million to 10 million. I think there are other broader factors around India confidence which are coming together. The agenda is not over, but I think that for IT, if their margins come down a little bit because they have to pay a little higher salary, it's not going to move the needle as a percentage of their top line.
Sure. And Manish, what other sectors you are seeing anything similar or even less but excitement? What other sectors are seeing excitement of this kind from a job perspective?
I mean, sales, customer service, and is probably the fastest growing, right? So people talk about industries. I prefer to talk about functions.
Yeah.
Sales is really the customer service, sales, just servicing domestic demand. Whether it is through e-commerce, whether it is through FMCG companies, whether it is through FMCD companies. As of now, people are just building out their distribution
Hmm.
systems and their
Right.
sales systems. We when we started this company 20 years ago, we were in 400 cities. Now we're in 5,000 cities, and we regularly get jobs in the long tail. Five
Right.
people here and 10 people there, and then two people in 1,000 cities we want. So I think that sort of long tail of India's geography of work, which is playing out, has also been reinforced because of the ability of e-commerce to service it. So you suddenly see all kinds of interesting ways that without physical presence, the demand is getting serviced. But without physical presence doesn't mean branch. You might need a feet on street person. You might need a coordinator. You're working out of distributors has become an important sales force for companies. So I say sales, customer service, logistics is really the fastest growing segment of India's job market. And does it pay the same as IT? Of course not. I mean, average salary in an IT staffing business 50 is 1 lakh for products, 55,000 for services, and our average salary is about 22,000 or 24,000, somewhere in between that for India's domestic sales, customer service, logistics, 0 to 2 years experience. But even that has gone up quite substantially, and the
Hmm.
bar is up substantially for productivity. So I think that digital skills, soft skills are getting built in these jobs, which I mean, the difference between a Kali Pili driver and an Uber driver is three things, right? The technology he has, the demand sourcing that he has, and the soft skills that he develops. So an Uber driver is 2 or 3 times more productive than a Kali Pili driver at one level.
Right.
So I think this is a little bit self-reinforcing. Sales, customer service, logistics. Again, in this we are seeing the big get bigger. I mean, I forgot to mention even in IT that's happening. Actually,
Hmm.
the talent is gravitating towards the bigger software services firms, and the middle and small software services firms are having Even talent challenges, of course, they're having market challenges. So there's a consolidation happening or a roll up even happening in them. But in sales customer service right now, that's where we are seeing the biggest challenges in actually hiring people. So, at a certain level, I might challenge IT companies that it's harder to hire a salesperson for FMCG than to hire a software programmer, because at least you can, figure out the ponds to go fishing in. So I'm not sure that I think we need to do a lot more in education reform and skill reform. But again, for India, I don't think the binding constraint is skills or education. If you think of China, China just ran a massive apprenticeship program, which was just learning by doing and learning while learning. And they moved their levels of productivity higher. So in the last few years of 10 years, supply side, some things have improved, but the demand side is, which is taking up now, will automatically lead to a lot of skill and productivity improvement.
Sure. So, Manish, coming to staffing business, which is, the two main drivers you'll have always talked about is one is formalization and the second is more outsourcing that's happening. So, where are we on this? And especially from a policy perspective, how is
Mhm.
policy helping both these areas?
I mean, I think that, the challenge for policy always has been the transmission losses between how the law is written, interpreted, practiced, and enforced. Right? I mean, if you have 69,000 compliances, 6,700 filings for corporate India, you have 26,410 ways to go to jail embedded in those 67,000 compliances. So India has been a hostile habitat for entrepreneurship. And you don't stop entrepreneurship, you just make it informal. And informal entrepreneurship breeds poverty because then you don't have productive firms. So I think our competitors have always been criminals or politicians, right? And they provide three services. If this guy asks for a permanent job, I'll break his legs. Gross salary is equal to net salary, and basically, they just don't um, follow the law. So for us, if you take away 42% of as payroll deductions from salary, suddenly haath wali salary versus chitti wali salary becomes a very difficult this thing. Now, has there been huge change in haath wali salary, chitti wali salary? Not as much as I expected. But what has improved is the enforcement of Provident Fund and ESI on an as is whereas basis. I think what has improved or changed within the demand side is COVID reminded people about the need to variabilize employee costs. Employee costs are, shareholders don't pay salaries, customers do. If customers go on strike, you need to figure out ways on how to variabilize your employee costs. So I think the broader theme of formalization, regulatory arbitrage going away is still in its early stages. But I think risk management, ESG is seems to be a fashionable term, but the most daily life manifestation of it is customers care more about compliance. Let's not put ESG in the spiritual aspects of sort of sustainability, but what it has is risk management, counterparty risk, vendor evaluation, has really shoved people away from the informal sector where you would hold your nose and say, I don't care whether you comply, to saying that I want to make sure that all my vendors comply. So I think the growth hasn't happened as much from the regulatory changes yet. The labor codes are still to be notified, I think. But overall, there is better enforcement because of digitization. But I think the wave of growth that we are seeing right now is driven by customers. They want to variabilize their costs, they care about compliance, and they care about hiring, which are the three drivers right now.
Right. So, I think you've talked about formalization going from current maybe 12, 13% to almost 20% by 2025. You see that, so what will that be driven by other than, the government, whatever regulations the government is doing? What else is driving that?
Customers care about compliance, customers care about your hiring abilities, and customers care about variabilizing costs. So, I mean, the 29% of the labor force in contract and temp employment in India is way too high. I mean, most countries are between 5 and 15%, right? Places like Japan and France are at 15, places like the US are at 5. So I think what will happen is the 129 million people in temp and contract and these are slightly old numbers, will come down to 60 million. But the share of the formal sector will go from 1 million to 30 million or 40 million. That's how I've always framed it at. At a certain level, this regulatory arbitrage going away will reduce the total size of temporary and contract in the economy, but it will substantially raise the share of the formal sector. So I think from an addressable market perspective, I don't think we need to worry. I think we're on track for the growth that we had thought that the market would demonstrate, and many adjacencies in specialized staffing, whether it is telecom staffing, whether it is IT staffing, whether it is healthcare staffing, these are all starting to become markets that we had thought would take much longer to develop, because the transformation of, we are the waiter in the restaurant, we are not the chef. Right, we don't decide what gets cooked. I mean, the three industries which created Teamlease are on strike right now, but it doesn't matter because other industries are taking their place. So actually, you can't predict the future. You can only prepare for the future. So when people ask us, are you targeting a certain industry or a sector? Well, only in the very immediate short term can you do that. In the long run, all we try and do is move to keep in touch with HR heads, alumni, CFOs who move from high growth businesses or high growth companies to other companies. They were a client there, they'll take you there. So over time, I think what will happen also for us is that, almost everybody hopefully will be an alumni of some company that they have serviced. And that's why our, 1,000, 1,500 companies that we service is a rounding error in the potential market. So actually, I don't spend as much time on our ability on expanding the addressable market right now. It's really our ability to execute, organizationally, the technology investments, the talent investments, the brand investments, the product investments. I mean, right now for our degree apprenticeships, which I've been fighting for 10 years, finally become legitimate under NEP. Degree apprenticeships is the future of education, and we have a skill university and an apprenticeship program which has always been held back by this lack of connectivity between the education and employability world. NEP plus COVID has finally getting some of that regulatory cholesterol out of the way. So I think that more than addressable market, what we as a company need to make sure we do is make ourselves worthy of this. This India scale, India calibration is not something many other countries have faced before when it comes to people supply chain sort of solutions. So hiring solutions, productivity solutions, and sort of e-workforce solutions are the three clusters of the company in which we're investing and trying to make sure. And all those three, at least I can confidently say, 80% of the infrastructure is yet to be built. The 2030, 2040 sort of infrastructure. And it couldn't have been built in the past because either customers were sort of sitting on the fence or the regulatory cholesterol held us back. Today, both regulatory cholesterol is coming down and customers want to variabilize cost. Customers care about compliance and customers care about your ability to hire in the long tail, not just in 30 cities. Everybody can hire in 30 cities. Yeah. You need to be able to hire in 5,000 cities now.
Right. So I guess looking from a competitive landscape, in fact, you've probably answered this question, which was multinational corporates in India who started early in this game haven't just managed to kind of scale up. And is that because of this long tail part that you're talking about?
Maybe. I think it is because, when a big company comes to a small country, they don't send their best people. I mean, I would say that, I think there are some businesses where, like cell phones, I think Samsung has an unfair advantage over Indian mobile phone manufacturers because of global investment in brand and product, right? I think there are some businesses, I think banking is a similar business. You don't have an unfair advantage. I don't think Citibank or Stan Chart has an unfair advantage over HDFC or Kotak. I think staffing is a similar business. It's an execution business. It's a local business. And these staffing companies aren't very global. I mean, Manpower, 50% of profits come from one country, France, not even the US. Right. I mean, so 40% of their profits come from France. So I would say that there are some businesses where being global where product matters, brand matters, like say cell phones, I think there's an unfair advantage for multinationals. I think staffing is an execution intensive business. It's a local intensive business. So I'm not saying that I have an unfair advantage over them, but they definitely don't have an unfair advantage over me. So what you compete on is really a level playing field
Sure.
as an Indian company versus a multinational. And I think talent also now in the past, now we are a listed company. We are quite generous with our, hopefully viewed as generous with our, you know, um, ESARs and our LT long-term incentives. We're able to pay people so that you can actually get wealthy working for Indian companies, right? I mean, I think those days are gone. I used to always fight with my mother whenever she saw somebody, उसकी शादी हो रही है, वो अच्छा लड़का है, multinational के लिए काम करता है, right? In her mind, what she was saying was that they were meritocracies and Indian companies were not. I think that now, the talent market, I think in the past, in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, multinationals had an unfair advantage in the labor market for hiring talent. I think that unfair advantage for talent has also gone away. I don't think they have access to capital that we don't have. So I think multinationals versus Indian companies, at least in our business, is no longer a criteria that should be looked at. It's really growth rates, execution, talent, strategy, which matters, right?
Sure. So then what is your competitive landscape? You have all these new companies coming in, but although right now they are not competing, probably they are more complementary. People like Apna, people like Work India. But where do you see this whole competitive landscape moving?
I mean, they are vendors, yeah. I mean, Naukri, Monster are not competitors for us.
Yeah.
They are vendors. I mean, we are customers for them at a certain
Yeah.
level, right? Because the matching business is very different from the repair business, which is different from the staffing business. I mean,
Yeah.
in fact, I would be very happy to see innovation in matching happen. It's a very important pain point for us. The
Yeah.
first Nobel Prize in Economics went to Peter Diamond for search costs and labor markets, which matters a lot to us. But Shapley and Roth got the Nobel Prize a few years ago for how equity markets clear on price, but labor markets clear on information.
Mm.
And you have to design these markets very differently. And I don't think we've seen the kind of innovation in labor market matching that I had hoped to see by now. So I think all these other companies coming in, we have our own HR tech investments, our higher tech investments, our reg tech investments, ed tech. I think these will all be really good for improving the productivity of the ecosystem and actually allowing us to scale in ways that today we can't scale. I mean, today our hiring engine is an ATM machine with a teller sitting behind it, physically handing cash, man. I mean, it looks like it's digitized, but it's like a guy. Yeah, so the scalability of that system is not there. If you digitize assessments, if you digitize hiring, if you digitize higher tech operations, I mean, we could scale to 1 million employees. Today, the binding constraint is really our own application of technology to hiring, but also the ecosystem's ability to solve this blue collar hiring or bottom of pyramid hiring problem, where information is not always, the information asymmetry continues to be a problem, signaling value continues to be a problem. So there are three, four very specific problems of information asymmetry, signaling value, willingness to migrate at the bottom of the pyramid, which have held back us, scaling to the level that I think we can someday. So all
Hmm.
these higher investments in tech in labor markets would actually be very helpful for us. I think. I don't think they're competitors in some sense because customers are not looking for a real estate broker who makes the introduction and tells you to go away. They're looking for a clearinghouse.
Hmm.
You need to guarantee the trade here. That's really what customers are looking for. They're not looking for pure, here you are willing to buy, he's willing to sell. Now you guys sort it out.
Right.
Because so I think that I don't think staffing is built on regulatory arbitrage, if that's what people think. I mean, our business will, if regulatory arbitrage go, I mean, my fight for labor reforms is not a suicide mission. Let's just put it that way. It's not going away. Our industry will grow if the regulatory cholesterol goes away.
Right. So if in a way both, people like, as you said, the HR agencies which are becoming more technology driven, actually they are helpful. Labor reforms are helpful. They'll actually help you grow, both of them.
think so, and supply side reforms. If our university and school system, if NEP did what it promises to do in the next 15 years, I hope they bring the glide path down to 5. Then I won't have to kiss 100 frogs or 200 frogs to find 5 princesses. No, today
Right.
I have to kiss 100 frogs to find 5 or 10 princesses. I mean, uh, we hire 5 or 10% of the kids who come to us for a job. Imagine if that went to 15 or 20%, the
Right.
improvement in economics and just the scaling would improve substantially.
Right. So in terms of margins in this business, that has been been relatively stagnant, I guess, from a competitive perspective. While you all talk about improvement in margins, mostly from what I understand, it's more to do with EBITDA margins because of scale or because of the nature of work. So maybe higher specialized or some. But within the same business, you all don't see improvement in margins. Why is that?
I mean, it obviously is a child of 90% informality, is a child of where the industry was born. But over time, if you look at our portfolio, the way we're thinking about general staffing versus specialized staffing versus our skill university versus reg tech, ed tech, right? So we have really 6 different businesses. The tech businesses are small but have much higher margins. Now all of them are getting to that level. But overall, what I would submit is that the pure general staffing business, you also have to look at return on capital. I mean, it is a very high return on capital business, is how I view it as. All our other businesses have higher margins, but they require oodles of capital. So we are always sort of worried about that equation. So I think that the margins go up as the informal sector goes away. It doesn't go up during the decline of the informal sector because there's always some sort of regulatory arbitrage available. So I'd say that, our long term, we went public at whatever 0.9%. Last year we were at 2%. So we've went from that. And our long term plans, we will see the margin expansion that we have targeted in the long run, somewhere between 3.5%, 4%. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So
I mean, you
maybe
have to decide whether you view us as a 5,000 crore company or a 500 crore company, right? I mean, whether we are a 2% margin on that or a 20%, 30% margin on this. I mean, globally, there is I mean, even Walmart is a 3% margin company, right? I mean, in
right.
a sense, because so much of it is flow through. So I think people think about our revenues in 2 different ways, and I think both are important because the nature of our business is that net revenues and gross revenues indicate different strengths and are growing at differential rates. And in a country where I think per capita income goes from 2,000 to 15,000, it'll be interesting to see the relationship between net revenue and gross revenue for just us as a company.
Right.
Because when we started this company 20 years ago, average salary was much lower than what it is today. But Arthur Lewis got his Nobel Prize for, I don't, your wages don't go up till you run out of farm labor. And then, and when you run out of farm labor, suddenly, non-farm wages explode. So we are waiting for what we call the Louisian turning point, because that'll
Right.
be a very important part of our own sort of long-term evolution as from staffing as a minority part of the industry to the majority part of the staffing industry when it goes formal, when wages go up, and then suddenly the relationship between gross revenues, net revenues, and margins will change also.
Right. And that's a very interesting point. So if let's talk a bit about the other businesses. You've alluded to them briefly, but staffing is something which is very well understood. Has been there for some time. But these new businesses, maybe what are your aspirations there? Like how big can they become?
See, Teamlease Skills University and NetApp is the future of education in my mind. It's only a whatever 600-700 crore business right now, but it really is the 5 design principles that we have learned about skills and employability: learning while learning, learning by doing, learning with signaling value, learning with qualification modularity, which means 3 month certificate opening balance for 1 year diploma, and learning with flexible delivery, which means online classroom, on job classroom, on campus classroom, and on site classroom are equal. So when we reflected on our last 10 years of learning, we said, look, you have to design something that overcomes these 5 design principles, because employed learners will cross full-time learners in India if you want to fix India. Full-time learners is a luxury that 40 million kids can afford. But we need to reskill 400 million people. These are people who are stuck in the wrong sector or in the wrong company or with the wrong skill set. So our skill university and apprenticeship program really targets employed learners. It targets more than prepare, it targets repair and upgrade. And I think that if the regulatory cholesterol around degree apprenticeships, where you get a degree over 5 years while doing an apprenticeship, while getting a stipend. We're in the last mile. We've now got 60,000 kids, but I should have had 500,000 kids. We are already probably the largest university by revenues, but we will be India's largest revenue by university by students, 5, 10, 15 years from now when regulatory cholesterol goes away. And that's an important supply chain for solving the hiring problems of Teamlease. So I think the Skill University apprenticeship program long-term trajectory is quite clear. RegTech is, we acquired a majority stake in a company called Aventis, and we're now just renaming it to Teamlease RegTech, which is really just the 67,000. We are the only live database with 69,000 compliances, 6,700 filings, and we update that database 8 times a day. It changed 8 times a day last year. Now, there's no company that can keep track of this. Maybe economists should say Teamlease RegTech is a company that should not exist. Well, that's true, but it does, and so do many other childs of regulatory cholesterol in India. So RegTech is a SaaS platform over time where companies need to manage their compliance. And EdTech is obviously a combination of corporate learning, which is a chunky one, employed learners, and a SaaS platform for universities. So we think all 3 of them are sort of related to the broader 3 E's of education, employment, and employability. But most importantly, they innovate at the intersection. Our EdTech company doesn't compete with pure EdTech companies because it's at the intersection of employment and education and employability. Our Skill University doesn't compete with traditional universities because it needs 1,000 employers for its degree apprenticeship program to be successful. So our vision of the new businesses, specialized staffing, I'm not covering because you understood we built that business to almost 40-50% of the staffing profits, which was zero at the time of the IPO. Yeah. So there was a conscious call to build a specialized staffing business. So those are the 2 big businesses. But the NetApp, EdTech, RegTech are really plays from a long-term perspective, which are not going headlong into competing with traditional players, but use our ecosystem of 2, 3, 4,000 employers to solve their problems. So they have come to us with saying, look, we have a problem with our entry-level hiring and we need to take employees for a test drive, but we want those employees to learn on the job. So that's where apprenticeships came in from. RegTech was driven by customers. They came to us saying, I want you to take away this problem for me. And EdTech came from the reality that the return on investment on corporate training programs is not high unless you get 3 things from corporate training programs, unless your attrition comes down, unless your productivity is higher, and unless your time to fill is higher. So we really pray to one God, which is employers. So if you think about all of our current strategy in all our 5 clusters of businesses across the 3 broad E's, 3 E's, is really driven by we're a B2B company. We don't find jobs for kids. We find kids for jobs. We don't offer training courses to kids. We offer training courses to employees. So I think that is the fundamental point. And I interestingly believe that all of these, especially the apprenticeship program, could be as large as, the core staffing business, because obviously they're in the long run. But all of them need some regulatory cholesterol. Like the RegTech needs a national open compliance grid, a proposal we have given to the government to take off. EdTech obviously needs degree apprenticeships and online universities to be licensed. So there's still some sort of boulders in our path, but we will go under them, over them, or through them is the idea.
So great. I think so overall, what I'm hearing here is sounding very optimistic about where India is heading in terms of not just the economy, from a job market. You're talking about formalization. You're talking about more outsourcing, and you guys seem to be in absolutely the right place. And from a competitive scenario, also, you're not so worried at this point, right? So, is that a right summary of how you've?
I mean, yeah, I mean, we wouldn't be entrepreneurs if we weren't delusionally optimistic. But I think that, it goes with the job. But I don't think hope is our strategy here. I think we have a very clear strategy that the structural transformation of India is gaining momentum. And it's not, and I'm not talking about the economic transformation, I'm talking about the structural transformation within our formal client base.
Yeah.
And they need very specific solutions around hiring, around staffing, around employability, which is productivity, and around e-workforce. So yes, I think that from our perspective, as I started at the beginning, it's not about addressable market. That is much larger. It's a buffet. We can't eat everything we see. We'll get sick. We have to pick our battles in this buffet. And execution is really the binding constraint, not addressable market.
Right. Great, Manish. Anything that we missed out? Anything else that you want to kind of just highlight? And because you're coming out.
No, I mean, I think that, it's a unique opportunity for us. China is really making our life much easier. So if we just use this momentum to take advantage of the opportunity that has been presented, being lucky in life is more important than being skilled.
Right.
Very often when you get to our age, I think we realize that. And I think India is very lucky post-COVID. And I think it's up to us to really take advantage of this because we were very weak for too long. One of my favorite Hindi poets, Ramdhari Singh Dinkar, he says, Shama shobhati us bhujang ko jiske paas garal ho. Only snakes with venom can be kind, benevolent, or generous. And,
Right.
the US fiscal deficit was more than our GDP this year. And they could do that. They could help their people because they have a strong economy, right? And so I think it's time for us to also sort of move into the top 50 per capita GDP, which will really, instead of keep on going about on fifth in total GDP, 138th in per capita GDP really is something that must change. And that will only happen with the productivity of firms, productivity of individuals, productivity of sectors, and productivity of our states going up.
Sure. Thanks so much, Manish, for your time. And
Take care, Sanjeev.
yeah, thank you.
Chat.
Yeah, thank you.